Welcome back to America Decides. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was on Capitol Hill today where he urged international partners to, quote, do everything they can, unquote, to expedite aid deliveries into Gaza. CBS News chief foreign affairs correspondent and the moderator of Face the Nation, Margaret Brennan, joins me here on the set. Great to see you, Margaret. I want to talk to you also about something that the National Security Adviser Jake Sullivan said at the White House briefing today, emphasizing the administration's push to increase the flow and the reliability of the flow of aid into Gaza. Let's listen.
Aid is flowing. It is not flowing at the rate that any of us would be happy with because we always want more. But we are actually seeing good cooperation between the U.S., the IDF, the UN, and other humanitarian organizations to ensure that aid goes from that pier to innocent people in need, and we'll continue to do that as we go forward.
Margaret, status check. Where are we on this?
Flowing might be generous because over the weekend, as you know, the World Food Program, which is overseeing the delivery from the pier to the actual distribution to the people, actually had to shut down some of the distribution because they had trucks raided by starving people, by also perhaps criminal elements mixed in there. But this issue of delivery, it has been the most central and most difficult thing when it comes to aid for weeks. And it has been one of the hardest parts of this to negotiate. But to be clear, backing this up to the question of the pier that the U.S. is defending from the White House podium, it is inefficient, it is insufficient to need. There's only something like 7 trucks worth of aid delivered off of a pier. It is far more efficient to have the flow through those land gates with additional deliveries, far more efficient also than dropping things from the sky.
Right. And what is the status of those land delivery areas, which the Israelis, for various reasons, and they have changed the justification over time, continue to either block, intercept, or slow?
Well, Jake Sullivan said today that there were 695 metric tons of food being delivered. I think those were off the pier going to a warehouse. And then it's the, okay, and then?
And then what?
And then what? But for those land entries, what we know is that at this moment in time, particularly since that IDF encirclement of Rafah in southern Gaza, those gateways that had been opened following President Biden's pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu then were closed. And that is not just the Israeli issue, that's also an Egyptian issue and somewhat of a Palestinian issue. And you heard Secretary Blinken get pressed on this today before Congress when he was testifying. And he very diplomatically said, well, the Egyptians are being great partners, but it would be great if they could do more. Some of what they were closing off on their side of the border was due to their frustration that the Israeli government sent its troops into Rafah. So they were protesting it. And from aid workers that I've talked to, they said, fine, protest it, but don't deny starving people food. On the IDF part of it, some of it is also just the logistics of moving people, aid workers, through areas that are contested and
right. Combat zones.
A combat zone. And you put IDF soldiers in there, you are going to also draw in Hamas fighters shooting at them and vice versa. So if you have to put in non-combatants in the midst of that, it's also highly dangerous. So this is a really complicated operation, and there is day-to-day pressure being brought by the Biden administration. But this brings you to those bigger debates and conversations about whether there's deliberate withholding of aid, whether there has been, at the government levels higher than the folks on the ground, decisions to make it more difficult. And we've seen explicit statements from some Israeli government ministers.
When pressed on this very question on CNN yesterday by Jake Tapper, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said, well, we deliver aid. We're very much in favor of that, but Hamas steals it or siphons it. I'm sure that is in some respects true. Is it totally the story?
No.
What is our visibility on that key question?
Well, the Israeli prime minister has said throughout that there is no obstruction on his government's part. However, if that were true, then he would not have taken power away from the ministers who were controlling aid access, some of them the more far-right nationalist ministers within his government, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. They were blocking at one point delivery of U.S. taxpayer-funded flour. So one of the things that happened after that phone call President Biden made that, as we all know, was very heavily publicized as a tough one a few weeks ago, Prime Minister Netanyahu took control from those ministers and said he would now play a direct role in overseeing aid operations. So if it was all fine and dandy, then come on. So, and you wouldn't have a famine in northern Gaza to the degree that you do now. Now, does that mean there aren't criminal elements? Absolutely not. And U.S. officials have said that. It's not just Hamas. There are also criminal elements. You also have crowds of starving people. There's a lot of exploitation that is happening there. And the scarcity only makes it, more of a profit-making incentive for some of these criminal enterprises to take food.
And very briefly, Margaret, the Israeli prime minister also talking to CNN sort of downplayed the idea of starvation or famine, like it's not really a real thing. What do we know?
It's a real thing. And we have had numerous people tell us some of the most horrific detail on our program on Face the Nation, whether it was the head of Doctors Without Borders, the head of Save the Children, the head of UNICEF. We have talked to people on the ground, the Scott Peterson, who runs UNRWA, a U.S. Army vet who is on the ground there, saying that they do not have food and water to meet the number of people they have. I have spoken to people who have left Gaza, who have told me that. And you are seeing that also, by the way, if you want to read the State Department report that was published under this National Security Memorandum that the president ordered, it detailed how severe the humanitarian deprivation had gotten. It also, by the way, mentioned ongoing Israeli court system investigations into criminal undertakings within the Israeli system.
Margaret Brennan, as always, thank you so much for your expertise and perspective.